Good everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had the latest half-year economic and fiscal update out from the Treasury. Myself and Matthew, one of our economists, were locked up for a couple of hours with a whole bunch of journalists and analysts. Minister of Finance came in and gave us a briefing. It sort of feels a bit like a early economics Christmas present, apart from how bad the numbers were. The government's got a pretty difficult position in front of it. The likes of the revenue numbers down $13 billion less over the next 4 years that the government is now going to collect in tax compared to what they thought. So bringing in less money, but at the same time, they're expecting to spend $5.6 billion more than was expected over the next 4 years at the budget. So definitely a worse economic and fiscal position for the government. You go through some of those indicators. This time around, the Treasury and Finance Minister have come out with a new fiscal indicator, Obergall X, which I thought was quite an exciting new adjustment. Sounds a bit like the new sort of iPhone or maybe a new Pokemon game coming forward. But the operating balance, excluding gains and losses, excluding as well ACC, which does make a bit more sense. We can go into that detail at a future time. But long story short, the government's still effectively living beyond its means all the way out now till 2029. Realistically, this is a pretty difficult set of fiscal positions. I mean, how bad is it, and how many more revisions further do you think we're going to have before we actually get some better fiscal news, at least?
Yeah, we've seen it for several years now, I think, where every time we get a new set of forecasts from the Treasury, every 6 months, the budget seems to be pushed out, or the surplus seems to be pushed out by a year. And, it's beyond the forecast horizon now. So there's no sign of that sort of fiscal position being turned around particularly quickly. And yes, okay, some of those issues are outside of the government's making in terms of how the economy is performing. And we'll talk about those sort of growth projections, I think, in a minute, and how they translate through into sort of weaker revenue for the government. But there is also the question, you highlight this sort of increased spending. And okay, again, some of that is around the economic cycle. We know if the economy is weak or unemployment is higher, you're going to be spending more on welfare benefits and that type of thing. But there is still a sense when you look through the government accounts that their spending is not being cut, not being reined back in anywhere near as much as the sort of rhetoric would have suggested. Probably now, but certainly before the election, when National were voted in on a promise of paring things back. And yes, again, the job cuts through the government sector in Wellington, but again, those haven't probably been that big in the context of how much government has grown over previous years. So they're sort of stuck in this middle ground, I think, where they are trying to get the fiscal position back under some sort of control, but also not trying to annoy too many people by really slashing and burning. And you almost get a sense that it's the worst of both worlds coming through for them, because they're not getting that fiscal position back to a surplus anytime soon, within the next 5 years that we can see. But you are sort of cutting enough around Wellington that people are feeling sort of down in the dumps around their sort of job security, and the general Wellington economy is struggling as well. So yeah, it's a difficult position for them to be in, but part of it I think is of their own making, and just continuing to push things forward, almost kick the can down the road a bit, rather than maybe making some harder decisions that need to really be made to turn things around here in terms of how this fiscal position is going. I mean, what do we see in terms of the economy and what Treasury is projecting, and how that flows through into the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, the economy is expected to turn around next year as expected, but it sort of isn't nearly as strong as had been forecast previously by the Treasury as well. Now, productivity is set to be weaker than expected. And also just the government said, look, even though the economy might be perking up a bit, the actual translation through into tax revenue isn't quite as strong. I mean, the likes of Treasury saw this year economic activity contracted 0.2% over the year to June. Next year, 2025, expecting to pick up to a sort of bit more measly 0.5%, but then afterwards, actually sort of a bit more of a jump up to 3.2, 3.3%, I think, in 2026, which again, that level of economic activity, you'd be expecting generally a bit more tax revenue to come through, but it's not. And the challenge, I think, for the government is, despite the fact that the economy is getting better, their own fiscal position isn't. And that's also leading them into some very sort of narrow navigational waters when it comes to spending. Treasury said at budget that the government needed $2.5 billion just to keep the lights on in terms of cost inflation and similar. They only gave themselves a $2.4 billion operating allowance, and that has been confirmed today that that operating allowance will continue at that $2.4 billion mark. Treasury also said today that only $700 million of that $2.4 billion is actually currently available. It hasn't already been pre-committed to things. It's a very limited amount to pay for cost inflation on a number of parts of government, the police and a number of others. At a time when we seem to be wanting to or talking about investing more in a number of critical areas, defence and the likes, but with sort of no additional funds. And I think that is going to be one of the challenges, like you say, for government almost getting the worst of both worlds. Core Crown expenses are still expected to be above 30% of GDP all the way out till sort of 28, 2029 and into the future. So realistically, we are going to see further reprioritizations, further cuts in spending, further savings trying to be found over the next year, but there doesn't seem to be a particularly coordinated view of what we need to get down to. Instead, it seems to be more of I guess, a reverse method where the government goes, we want to spend this much, we're going to do that anyway. If we can find some savings to offset some of that, all good, but we know we're still not going to have anywhere near a balanced budget, so we're just going to borrow the rest and sort of wait for another day. That means that net debt and similar sort of draws out, so it is a really difficult position. I mean, should they be going harder and faster?
Well, looking through the numbers, it strikes me it's particularly easy, I think, to pour more petrol on the fire or put your foot down to the floor from a government perspective point of view in terms of growing the size of government. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is that it's very hard to turn that around and start to bring back the size of government down to what might be something more manageable or, more sustainable over the longer term. And so we're seeing the it's almost like a similar thing to house prices, right? They go up a lot of the time. It's very difficult to actually engineer them down, especially in any sort of orderly fashion. And so I think that, the government, it's kind of, not willing for me to make the hard decisions. And like you say, looking and going, we want to do this spending, and then how do we sort of work that out, back out in terms of savings or cost cuts on the other side that need to be made to achieve that target, rather than actually focusing on what's a realistic, what's a sustainable size of government going forward from here, and then going, okay, well, what fits within that envelope? And sure, you may come to a conclusion when you've gone through all the maths and gone through all the numbers that actually you have to still have a government in the meantime or in the near term, which is going to be outside the size of that envelope, over the size of that scope that you will be aiming for. But at least you're making an informed decision. This seems to me just very much about a bit of ad hoc policy along the way. And yes, I know you've got coalition partners that you need to keep happy as well. And there's a whole bunch of things, other factors to take into account alongside that. But ultimately, I don't think they're sort of focusing on they're sort of focusing a bit on the means rather than focusing on the true end. And so, if you're doing that, you are probably going to struggle to meet what your goals you should be looking for further down the track. So probably a little bit of a disappointing outcome for me. I'm a little hopeful maybe as the economy starts to recover through 25 and certainly into 2026 that some of those tax numbers might start to turn around a little more quickly and provide a bit more room for the government. But it is still ultimately a very slow and difficult road back towards surplus and budget sustainability as far as I can see.
And you're right. I think there's a bit of hope in a sense that as the economic numbers start to improve, it does give you a little bit more choice of how to make those very difficult decisions, but they are still difficult. Although someone asked today, if this is looking like austerity politics, and I found that hard to believe given that you've got a $2.4 billion operating budget. It's just that once you've gorged yourself sort of that much, once the size of the government is that big, like you say, very difficult to sort of pull it back from there. We'll consider how all of this plays out, particularly in the lead up to Budget 2025, what eventually gets funded, what gets kicked out to make way for that new funding, and how the government tries to navigate those very narrow fiscal waters in one of our future editions of Econ Talks.